The Island by Harte. The Nessians prefer the sound of a breath-driven instrument, and they called to the sea as my darling was laid to her rest that late summer day in the place I thought of as the end of the world. First trumpets as we took her small body to the place, and then the nose flute crying into the ocean. I kissed her coffin there on the hill as the sea crashed below. Such a small casket for so many hopes. It is over now. She is gone. So much is gone. My love for her, the future, and worst of all, my responsibility. I have failed her. She is dead. I walked down the hill before the final farewell was called, and took a carriage back to town. I walked through the centre of town and went into a familiar bar. It was one I'd been to many times before. The barmaid took my order, gin with quinine water. I sat at a table and waited for the airship back to the White City. I thought of Josephine, my baby who was no more, my sweetness, my unknown. She lived for 3 days, struggling to breathe. Such an effort she made, such a desire to be. I thought of the Nessians. Damn their farewell for a person gone. Damn their sorrow and their celebration of life and death. Damn that sentimental world of shared misery. I was alone, and I was bleeding from my soul, like a burst balloon, like a flooded plain. I was raised on a farm in Balclutha in Britain, the product of a lady from the Institute and a local man. I lived with my father until I was 10 years old, and then they took me to the Institute. I have bred pure. I am considered. My old grandmother and my father let me go. I did not care too much for their sorrow. I was on fire, so much to do, so much to learn. An institute is a place of wonder, a place of knowledge. And now I sit in a bar at the other end of the world, in Aotearoa, in the new centre for the new order, full of regret. I sang a song of my youth, not the fancy notes of clever society, but the keening call of the lost at sea and on land. And as I went through the joy and the loss, another voice matched mine, rising and falling. I looked up. It was the icon I worked with. His name was Nartis. For the last 6 months he was my assistant. He was an artificial, a product of the White City. His paint was fresh. The geometric shape on his face was sharp. He favoured a kind of cartouche. The icons paint their faces every day. Sit down, I said. I looked at him. Slim body, about my height. He was not a person, but a thing made by the White City, a product of a civilization long gone, an artificial, a machine, his body powered by a myopod, his pattern a copy of the Arnold automaton. We worked well together. He learned my world. He was clever and insightful, a marvellous assistant, always attentive, always obedient. Why are you here? I said. The tests we are doing are complete. The next steps are ready to be done. Soon after, we left to catch the airship ferry. We walked up George Street and turned into an alley. The airship was docked in a field at the back. They were ready to leave. We hurried across. We climbed on board and sat at the back. It was warm inside, and the light through the windows was a honey gold. I fell asleep. Nartis woke me up. We'd cleared the surrounding hills and were heading up the valley towards the White City. The ship shook as we went through the air. We turned side on, and I could see the city through the window, rising high against the back wall of the valley. We slowed and landed close to an opening in the rock wall. The ship was secured, and we walked inside the mountain. The worker drones had fixed the old lifting cages, and I took one of those up to my level. I stepped outside the doors and went into my still room. Benches were covered by flasks and tanks. A table in the corner held notes on the tests we were doing. The results were promising. We'd made a new line of elixirs and tonics to cure the sick. I went to the drawing room. I sat in one of the chairs and felt so tired. I went to sleep. Later in the evening, a servant woke me. The night lights were on, and the room was almost dark. "It is 9 o'clock, miss. Would you like something to eat?" I felt fine, but there was the start of a headache, and I still felt tired. "Bring some soup to my room. I will go to bed." Next day I woke early. My partner, Tama, was not back. He was staying with family for Josephine's farewell. It felt good to be alone, good that I did not have to listen to the messages of sorrow. I went to the refectory for breakfast. The room was almost empty. I ate a small breakfast with coffee. Marie, the Chancellor of the Institute, was at a table close by. She was with Cass, Maitland, and the others when they rediscovered the White City. She is an expert on elements and built the Arnold automaton. As I left, she called me over and asked me to sit. Reluctantly I did so and fixed my expression ready for the sympathy. She looked at me. "You put in a plan to go to Aihupuku Island for the transit of Afrod. Do you still want to go?" I looked at her. In the last few months I'd not thought much about it. I assumed I would be doing other things. The original idea was to go to the island and take sightings of the planet as it passed in front of the sun. A number of other institutes and sect houses were doing the same in various parts of the world. A sighting from an island so far south would be useful. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I'd like to go." "We can't put too much effort into this. You know, an airship goes down there twice a year to check for castaways and reprovision the emergency supplies. The autumn one goes in 3 weeks. You would have to gather supplies and plan to leave by that date. The ship will come and pick you up 6 months later. The conditions on the island are harsh at best. There's a good chance you may not make it alive through the winter. You could take the icon, is it Natus, with you, but that is all." She looked at me. "If you can give me an answer by the end of today, we might just make it." I left her and went back to my room. Tama was back. He was in the washroom. I went out on the balcony to wait for him. The idea of going to the island seemed stupid, but when I thought of the day stretching ahead, it filled me with dread. He came out. He looked worried and tired. I knew this was hard for him, but I was so tied up in my own grief I had not thought of his. He kissed me on the cheek. I hugged him. He was still damp from his wash, and he smelled like a baby. I drew back. "Marie has asked if I want to go to Aihupuku Island to observe the transit. What do you think? It would be for 6 months. I would leave in 3 weeks on the supply airship. The icon I worked with, Natus, would go with me. It would be just him and me." I shivered slightly as I thought of that cold place. He paused, Then he smiled for the first time in so long. "If you want to go, then I'm fine with that. You are my darling, and though we have lost so much, I'm still here and I still want to go on." "Of course," I said. "Of course, it's just—" I looked down. "Though if you die there, it will likely be the end of me as well," he said. So much planning in such a short time. Once word of the expedition got out, I was deluged with suggestions and plans for tests. The island was isolated and deep in the Southern Ocean. Every expert from bird to fish to sea mammal to plants wanted to get some kind of tests done in this unique environment. And that did not include tracking the transit of Afrod. For that we needed precise machinery calibrated and mounted to take advantage of the 4 or 5 hour window of the transit. Kes herself brought the master chronometer from Singapore for the observation. On the day I left, I was feeling anxious. The frenetic activity to get ready had occupied me so much, the pain of my loss was a little dull. That morning when I woke, it all came back, and I dragged myself out of bed, ready for the trip. I wept a few tears as I left Tama. I could tell he was sad, but he was being strong. We were flying on the Zephyr, a medium-sized airship about 60 meters long. We left on a clear morning with a hint of winter cold. The sun had not reached the valley floor and was shining on the mountain tops. Nartis and I walked up the ramp at the rear of the ship. The captain met us at the top and assigned an airman to show us to our rooms. All the equipment was packed in the hold, and as we walked past, I mentally checked the crates and boxes, glassware, tables, crates with powders, and the large crate that held the telescope and its mount. The interior was standard airship, pale walls, windows looking out to the view below, cabins on either side of a corridor running down the centre. I was allocated a cabin, but we would not need to sleep. The island was about 800 kilometres south. We would get there by nightfall. I was in my cabin when I felt the ship cast off, a bump and a slight feeling of heaviness as we moved into the sky. I walked up to the bridge and watched from the wide windows as we slowly rose, turned, and headed south. I spent the day with various members of the crew going through the plans for when we landed. The stores were loaded in strict order. All tasks were allocated. The Zephyr had been down to the island a few times. This time they had bigger plans as they were leaving me behind. In the past they found a series of caves close to the sea. The plan was to make one habitable. As such, we had matting, some furniture, panels for doors and insulation, and some heavy-duty ponspacks to provide heat and steam power. The winter on Aihupuku was not something to be taken lightly. At about 4 in the afternoon, the captain called me over. He pointed down through the clouds, and there, first as just a few glimpses, but soon filling the window was the island, my home for the next 6 months. It was bigger than I had thought. We landed at the end of the harbour, close beside the cliffs. The beach was covered in driftwood. A natural track led from the beach up to the bluffs. The captain tried to point out the caves in the cliff face, but I could not see them. It was raining, not a hard rain, but a gentle, persistent rain that said, "I've been doing this for days and I can go on for as long as I feel like." Nartis, the captain, and I walked around the edge of the beach and up a long meadow below the cliffs. I could see the cave entrances now. They were about 50 meters along the cliff, dark holes against the lighter rock. We walked up and into one of the openings. It was hardly home, but I could see how we could make a door, close off a cave and create a secure living space. Inside was about 8 meters high and 10 meters wide. It extended quite far back. There would be room for a test area and living areas. Not exactly the Savoy, the captain said, but it was a most complete world, and what I needed, isolated and to some extent controlled. I looked out on the place, the landscape I would be part of, hard, cold and unforgiving, and I took it to my heart. Here I would make my life. I would be real. We walked back down to the shore and started the process of moving supplies. 2 days later it was done. The cave entrance was closed off, the floor was covered in matting. Pack lights and heating were installed, and enough supplies to last the winter and beyond. The aircrew had managed to install a fireplace with a chimney poking out the front of the cave. On that final night we all gathered together. Officers sitting at the table in the cave, crew serving and also taking advantage of the casks of wine and beer stored in the corners. It was a merry time. The crew had worked hard and this was their night for celebration. The cook had surpassed herself, and we had a meal that went from soup to fish to meat to a large boiled pudding. Each course was matched to different wine, and by the time we got to the port, everyone was in fine form. We finished with an hour of singing, crew and officers. We sang favourite and sentimental songs. In truth, it was more pirate than navy, but the old habits from the naval service came to the fore, and by 10 that night it was just me, the captain and Harte seated by the new fire. The flames were shot with colour as the driftwood burned. It was hardwood, too hard to cut with a saw, but there was plenty of it washed on shore from distant parts. From what I could see, the island did not have any trees. The wood had come from far across the ocean. I could hear the wind outside rising and falling with the occasional sound of rain, or maybe sleet, like a handful of gravel thrown against the cover across the cave opening. Pack lights shone on the cave walls, making small shadows of the creases in the rock. Pack-powered heating made the whole space warm. I looked to the wall, where the crew had made a bed for me, cut from the rock wall. I overheard the crew talking about knights and ladies lying at rest in cold chapels, but the bed was made soft by coverings and bright with coloured blankets. It looked almost Eastern. Various tables and store areas made up the back part of the cave, tables already partly laid out with pieces of telescope and boxes of glass bottles. Natas and I would be busy putting all this in order. The number of tests and observations we had to do made a long list. We would be busy. I talked to the captain for a while, mostly about timings and final checks of equipment and survival, what to do if we were reduced to nothing. A quick death for me would be the result, but I did not say that. The captain took his leave. I came out the door at the front of the cave. The wind whipped at me and the rain blew horizontal across the bay. It was going to be a challenge, and it was cold. He waved his goodbyes and I watched as his light moved down the meadow toward the shore. He would send someone in the morning before they left, but this would be the last I would see of him until we were picked up months later in what passed for springtime. I went back inside. The light and heat made the cave seem cozy. I went to bed and was asleep within minutes. And I dreamed. It was true, this was the time, and I was there. I opened the big doors at the front of the cave and started my day. I struggled. I walked into the sea. The water washed over me. I swam into the stream off the edge of land, into the ocean's swell. It heaved me into the air, like a piece of the driftwood that took that place, that took that track. The water was so cold, so clean and so pure, like a release. I relaxed and sank beneath the waves, and so I died there, washed in the ocean, not far from the shore, not far from land, still a thing, still a unit. Nartis took my body to the place and covered me with rocks and put me to sleep in the ground. And I want you to know that I love you all and I am at peace. There is no blame or judgment. I woke suddenly from that dream. I took a gasp of air, almost like the water in my lungs was real. Nartis came over. He looked at me. Would you like tea? It is 4 a.m, still some hours before dawn. I nodded and looked around. The cave was strange. So dark in the corners and ceiling, the fire still had some embers. I got up, stirred them and added some wood. Soon the multicoloured flames burned. Nartis brought me tea and I sat and watched the fire. I dreamed that I swam into the bay and drowned myself, and that you'd buried me under the rocks above the cliffs. I looked at him. He was watching me. Would you stop me if I tried to do that? He paused. He looked almost sheepish. Did they warn you I might do something like that? Did they give you instructions? I would not stop you if you tried to do that. I smiled at him. Maybe this will work. The pain is still there, but so is the certainty that I do not want this to end. That is new. I drank my tea and went back to bed. This time I did not dream, and Nartis woke me to the dawn's light. He had already folded back the large doors at the front of the cave. The day was blue and bright, but a cold wind poured into the cave. I shivered in my bed, then threw the covers off. I hope it's not too cold, Nartis said. It's perfect, and the light is beautiful. He had coffee ready, almost the last of the fresh milk. I walked beside the cliffs towards the airship rather than wait for someone from the crew. The area was quiet. A few of the crew were manning ropes, and a small knot of people stood near the ramp at the rear of the craft. As I approached, I saw the captain and other officers. He waved. Bit of a wind, but at least we have good weather, he smiled. I watched them do their last checks. The captain wished me well. The crew gave me a hat, and then suddenly the ship was away, climbing into the sky, turning to the north and powering out over the sea. I watched for a while as they got smaller, then turned and walked back to the cave. It took us a week to set up our equipment. We had a detailed plan of tests to be done, items to be gathered, and observations to complete. Each table was set up for a different purpose: collecting and noting, weather observation, testing plants and water. Finally, we had everything in place. Nartis was a huge help, sometimes telling me what to do, sometimes an aid memoir, and other times just good company. We started a routine of early morning tasks, then a good hour for lunch, and then closing the doors at night and settling into the cave. I always had a fire. Sometimes I would cook, and sometimes I would ask Nartis to cook. He was a better cook than me, and his meals were extremely good. He could not kill any living thing, so he would bring me fish and lobsters. It was my task to dispatch them and hand them over for cooking. I felt the weight of karma each time I slipped a knife in, but the result was so delicious. The weather was atrocious. It could change in the space of an hour, and always there was a constant wind. After a week, the daily temperature was dropping, and the daylight hours were getting shorter. I had my eye on Mount Honey rising over the island. I wanted to get up there before the weather was too bad. Nartis estimated we could make it to the top and back in a day. We made our plans and kept an eye on the weather. 2 days later, conditions were perfect, and we set out in the early morning across the short plain to the base of the mountain. The first challenge was to crawl through about 100 meters of low shrubs. It was impossible to walk because there were stiff branches positioned at waist height. We had to crawl under the canopy. The whole process was made worse by the chance of meeting a seal or sea lion. Nartis went first. The icons are extremely strong and almost indestructible, but they're very light. If they get leverage, they are unmovable, but if pushed or thrown in the air, it is a problem. We made it through and started up the side of the mountain across the gently sloping ground. It was not really a mountain, a little over 500 meters high, but there was an element of risk with the uncertain weather and landscape. As it happened, the climb was uneventful, apart from getting bogged in marshy ground. The slopes were covered in clumps of yellow flowers, interspersed with snowgrass. The air was pure, like mountain water, and we reached the summit by 12 midday. The wind died down as I stepped on the top, and the view stretched around me. I could see the flat island extending to the north, and the tiny shapes of mollymawks or petrels gliding in the air over the sea. Time stood still. I crouched in the lee of a rock and ate some food, hot soup and bread and some honey cakes. Nartis walked further down the ridge collecting samples of plants. We stayed for an hour and then set off back to shore. It started to rain when we were halfway down, and the rest of the walk was miserable, soaking wet and buffeted by the wind. The crawl back through the shrubs seemed to go on forever. I was grateful to see the doors of the cave come into sight, and almost fell into a chair close to a pack heater. Nartis laid out dry clothes for me and lit a fire. The aircrew had cut a bath out of the rock close to the entrance. At the time, I thought it was a joke, but now I asked Nartis to fill it, and I would try a bath. A few minutes later, I was immersed in hot water, a glass of wine perched on the side of the rock bath. What a wonder! I kept the pack heater in the water until the steam rose around me like a hot fog. I slept well that night, but woke feeling drained and depressed. Too much wine. Since Josephine died, more than 2 glasses of wine made me sad the next day. Suddenly it all seemed bad. Thoughts kept pushing into my head, and I felt the happy mood from the day before was gone. I went outside, and the weather matched my mood, cold and windy, with small flecks of sleet rushing by. I walked down to where the seals lay on the beach. Most of them were gone, but there was one pair I recognized. The pup was small, born late. I sat on a rock and watched the small body as she lay on the shore. I saw the mother come back to her pup. It was late in the season, too late to make it right. Not much movement, not much hope. I went back to the cave and forced myself to work cataloguing and labelling the items we collected the day before. Next morning I went down and saw the mother seal as she sniffed at the dead body. She looked to the sea, the rolling ocean, the future, the hope of life. The time was shifting. She took one more look, a long consideration, and then she was gone into the sea, gone to start again, urgency and judgment, action and statement. I went back to the cave and took a blanket and walked down to the rocks where the still body of her hope lay dead. I rolled her into the cover and dragged her up above the cliff, and I covered her child with rocks. And I called her Sissy, like the ancient Sisyphus, the endless process of start and hope and start again. A small baby, a small seal soul, taken back and born again. As that day went by, I began to feel better. The thought of that small seal lying almost on the same spot where I dreamed Nartis had laid my body seemed like a release, like a payment. It was almost as if she had died so I could live. I felt I owed her for my hope. Irrational thought, superstition, but it felt right. I grabbed it with both hands and took that thought into my life. From that point the weather became worse, and my mood became better.